The human mind fears many things: rejection, failure, loss. But there is something even more unsettling than all of them: becoming invisible. The moment someone realizes they can no longer command your attention, a quiet psychological shift begins. Questions start forming in their mind. Why did they stop responding? Why are they no longer reacting? Why doesn't my presence affect them anymore? This is the hidden psychology behind ignoring people. It is not powerful because silence is mysterious. It is powerful because attention is one of the most valuable forms of human currency. The moment you stop spending it carelessly, people begin recognizing its true value. Most people never think of attention as something precious. They give it away without hesitation. They respond to every criticism, chase every misunderstanding, defend themselves against every opinion, and allow every negative person to occupy space in their mind. Without realizing it, they reward behavior that should never have received their energy in the first place. Human psychology is remarkably simple in this regard. Whatever receives attention tends to repeat itself. Whether that attention comes through praise, anger, arguments, or emotional reactions makes very little difference. To the other person, the message remains the same. I still have influence over your mind. Robert Greene repeatedly reveals that power is rarely about controlling others directly. It is about refusing to surrender control over yourself. The easiest way for someone to influence you is not through force. It is by controlling what occupies your attention. If a careless comment can dominate your thoughts for hours, they have already gained more power over you than you realize. If someone's silence fills you with anxiety, your emotional state is no longer your own. And if another person's approval determines your peace of mind, then your attention has quietly become their possession. Think about how often people react instead of choosing. Someone ignores their message and they immediately send another one. Someone insults them online and they spend the rest of the day defending themselves to strangers. Someone refuses to appreciate them, and instead of walking away, they invest even more time trying to prove their worth. Every reaction feels justified in the moment, but psychologically, it creates a dangerous pattern. The more emotionally available you become to people who do not value you, the more you teach them that capturing your attention requires very little effort. Now imagine someone whose attention is protected. They are not rude. They are not arrogant. They simply refuse to allow every person or situation to dictate where their focus belongs. They understand that attention is limited, and anything limited becomes valuable. When someone disrespects them, they do not rush to argue. When someone plays emotional games, they do not compete. When someone seeks unnecessary drama, they quietly remove themselves from it. Their silence is not a performance designed to make others suffer. It is the natural result of knowing that their goals, peace, and personal growth deserve far more attention than meaningless conflict. This is where the dark psychology of ignoring people reveals its true power. The person who cannot provoke you often begins questioning themselves instead. Human beings naturally expect emotional reactions. They expect arguments, explanations, or attempts to regain approval. When none of those reactions appear, uncertainty begins replacing certainty, and uncertainty has a remarkable effect on the human mind. People become curious about what they can no longer influence. They begin paying attention to the very person who stopped giving attention away so freely. But there is a critical difference between strategic self-control and emotional manipulation. Many people pretend to ignore others while secretly checking their phone every few minutes, hoping for a response. Their silence is only another way of asking for validation. That is not power. It is hidden dependence. Real strength begins when your attention naturally returns to your own purpose instead of remaining trapped by someone else's actions. You stop ignoring people as a tactic and start doing it because your life has become too meaningful to be interrupted by every distraction. Never underestimate the value of protecting your attention. Every hour you spend chasing people who do not appreciate you is an hour stolen from becoming the person you are capable of becoming. Your attention shapes your habits shape your character, and your character shapes your future. The people who command the greatest respect understand that attention is not something to distribute carelessly. It is an investment, And wise investments are made intentionally, not emotionally. The moment people realize they can no longer control your focus through criticism, rejection, or emotional games, they begin seeing you differently, not because you demanded respect, but because you stopped rewarding everything that never deserved your attention in the first place. And once you reclaim control over your attention, the next step is mastering emotional detachment, because ignoring people only becomes truly powerful when your inner peace no longer depends on their reaction. The moment you stop giving your attention away so freely, something unexpected begins to happen. People who once controlled your emotions often search for another way to regain influence. They may criticize you, become unusually kind, create unnecessary drama, or suddenly pretend to care more than they ever did before. Why? Because they are no longer receiving the reaction they once expected. This is where most people fail. They may ignore someone physically, but emotionally they remain completely attached. They replay conversations in their minds, constantly wonder what the other person is thinking, and secretly hope their silence will produce a specific reaction. That is not power. That is emotional dependence wearing the mask of confidence. The dark psychology of ignoring people teaches that ignoring only becomes powerful when your peace no longer depends on whether the other person notices your absence. Robert Greene often demonstrates that the greatest advantage in any relationship belongs to the person who has mastered themselves before trying to influence anyone else. Human beings instinctively search for emotional weaknesses. They observe what makes you jealous, what makes you insecure, what earns your forgiveness too quickly, and what causes you to lose control. Once they discover those emotional patterns, influencing you becomes remarkably easy. They no longer need to argue with you because they already know which emotional button to press. Every predictable reaction quietly hands them the power they were looking for. Think about how many people say they have moved on from someone, yet they check that person's social media every day. They tell others they no longer care, but every post, every photograph, and every online activity continues affecting their emotions. On the surface, they appear detached. Internally, they remain completely connected. Their attention may have disappeared from the conversation, but their emotions are still controlled by someone else's actions. This is one of the greatest psychological traps people fall into. They confuse physical distance with emotional freedom, when in reality, the two are completely different. Now imagine someone whose emotional stability comes from within instead of from other people. They don't become overconfident because someone praises them, and they don't lose sleep because someone criticizes them. They understand that another person's opinion is simply information, not a definition of their worth. If someone chooses to leave, they accept reality without chasing. If someone returns, they evaluate the situation with wisdom instead of loneliness. Their decisions are guided by principles rather than temporary emotions. This creates a psychological presence that is incredibly difficult to manipulate because their emotional state no longer changes with every external event. This is why emotional detachment is often misunderstood. It does not mean becoming cold, heartless, or incapable of love. It means refusing to let your inner peace become dependent on someone else's behavior. You still care about people. You still appreciate meaningful relationships. But you no longer allow another person's attention, approval, or rejection to determine your value. That quiet independence changes every interaction because people naturally recognize when they can no longer control your emotional state. There is another psychological truth that few people recognize. The person who needs the least emotional validation often possesses the greatest influence. Why? Because they cannot be easily persuaded through praise, guilt, fear, or rejection. If compliments no longer inflate your ego, flattery loses its power. If criticism no longer destroys your confidence, insults lose their purpose. If silence no longer creates anxiety, emotional games stop working entirely. Suddenly, the other person realizes that the methods which once controlled you have become completely ineffective. Many people believe ignoring someone is about making them regret losing you. But if your silence exists only to create guilt or curiosity, you are still emotionally tied to the outcome. Your happiness still depends on their reaction. True detachment asks a much deeper question. Would I still choose this path if they never noticed? If the answer is yes, then your decision comes from strength. If the answer is no, then you are still seeking validation in a different form. Notice how the most emotionally powerful individuals rarely appear desperate to prove anything. They don't rush to explain themselves. They don't fight every misunderstanding. They don't chase people who have already chosen to walk away. Instead, they invest that emotional energy into becoming wiser, stronger, healthier, and more disciplined. Their focus shifts from controlling other people's choices to mastering their own responses. That single shift changes everything because your greatest power has never been the ability to control another person. It has always been the ability to control yourself. The dark psychology of ignoring people reaches its highest level when your silence is no longer a strategy, but a reflection of genuine emotional freedom. People begin realizing they cannot manipulate you through attention, rejection, or emotional pressure because your peace exists independently of their approval. And when someone discovers they no longer have access to your emotions, they also lose the ability to control your actions. And once emotional detachment becomes your greatest strength, the next step is learning how silence forces people to confront their own thoughts, often more powerfully than any words ever could. Once you have learned to protect your attention and free yourself from emotional dependence, you discover a form of influence that most people completely underestimate: silence. Human beings are conditioned to expect explanations. They expect arguments after disagreements, messages after distance, and emotional reactions after conflict. This expectation creates a predictable pattern. Most people speak because they are uncomfortable with uncertainty. But the dark psychology of ignoring people reveals something very different. Silence is not merely the absence of words. It is the presence of unanswered questions. And unanswered questions have a remarkable ability to occupy the human mind far longer than explanations ever could. Robert Greene often explores a timeless truth about human nature. People become fascinated by what they cannot fully understand. The human mind dislikes unfinished stories. It searches for missing pieces, invents possible explanations, and replays events over and over in an attempt to create certainty. This is why strategic silence often has a stronger psychological impact than endless conversation. When you explain everything, there is nothing left for the other person to think about. But when you refuse to react impulsively, their own imagination begins doing the work that your words never could. Think about what happens after an argument. Most people immediately begin defending themselves. They send long messages explaining their intentions, proving their innocence, or trying to correct every misunderstanding. They believe more words will solve the problem. Yet in many situations, those extra explanations only reveal insecurity. The more desperately someone tries to control another person's opinion, the more obvious it becomes that they are emotionally dependent on that opinion. Instead of appearing confident, they unintentionally communicate fear, the fear of being misunderstood, rejected, or forgotten. Now imagine someone who responds differently. They have already spoken honestly. They have already acted with integrity. When unnecessary conflict begins, they choose silence instead of endless debate. They do not chase people who have already decided not to understand them. They do not waste hours trying to convince someone determined to believe the worst. Their silence is not an act of arrogance. It is a quiet recognition that not every misunderstanding deserves their energy. They understand that dignity is often protected by knowing when to stop speaking. This creates an interesting psychological effect. The person expecting an emotional reaction suddenly receives nothing. Instead of hearing another explanation, they are left alone with their own thoughts. And the human mind rarely enjoys empty space. It immediately begins searching for answers. Why didn't they argue? Why didn't they defend themselves? Why were they so calm? Have they moved on? Did I misjudge them? Notice what has happened. The focus has shifted. Instead of you trying to convince them, they begin questioning themselves. That shift is where the true influence of silence begins. There is another reason silence carries so much power. It prevents you from revealing unnecessary information. Every emotional reaction tells people something about you. It reveals your fears, your insecurities, your expectations, and your emotional triggers. Someone who constantly reacts becomes easy to predict, and predictable people are easier to manipulate. But when your responses are thoughtful instead of impulsive, people lose access to the emotional map they once relied upon. They can no longer predict how you will react because you are responding with intention rather than emotion. This does not mean silence should become a weapon used to manipulate or punish others. Many people misuse silence by giving the silent treatment, hoping to create guilt or emotional pain. That is not strength. It is simply another form of emotional control. True psychological power comes from silence that is rooted in self-respect, not revenge. You are not refusing to speak because you want someone to suffer. You are choosing not to waste your energy where your words no longer create value. There is a profound difference between avoiding unnecessary conflict and playing emotional games. History repeatedly shows that the most influential people are rarely the loudest people in the room. They speak with purpose because they understand that words lose value when they are used carelessly. Their silence creates anticipation. Their restraint creates curiosity. And their calm presence forces others to observe more carefully instead of reacting automatically. They know that every unnecessary explanation weakens authority, while every thoughtful pause strengthens it. The dark psychology of ignoring people reaches a new level when your silence no longer feels uncomfortable to you. It becomes a reflection of confidence rather than uncertainty. You stop believing that every accusation deserves a defense, every criticism deserves a reply, or every misunderstanding deserves an explanation. Instead, you allow your actions, your consistency, and the passage of time to speak where words no longer can. And in doing so, you discover that silence often teaches people more about your value than any speech ever could. And once silence begins speaking on your behalf, the next step is building a life so focused on purpose that ignoring distractions becomes effortless rather than intentional. After mastering your attention, your emotions, and the power of silence, you reach a point where ignoring people is no longer a strategy. It becomes a natural consequence of having a meaningful life. This is where most people misunderstand the psychology of influence. They believe powerful individuals ignore others because they are arrogant or emotionally distant. In reality, the strongest people are often the busiest building something that matters. They are so deeply invested in their purpose that they simply cannot afford to let every distraction steal their focus. The dark psychology of ignoring people is not about pushing others away. It is about becoming so committed to your own direction that unnecessary noise gradually loses its ability to reach you. Robert Greene often reveals that purpose creates power because it gives your life a center that cannot be easily shaken. People without direction are constantly searching for something to fill the emptiness. They chase approval, attention, entertainment, and emotional drama because they have nothing greater demanding their energy. Every opinion feels important. Every criticism feels personal. Every rejection feels devastating. But the moment your life becomes guided by a meaningful purpose, your priorities begin to change. You no longer ask, how do I make people notice me? You begin asking, does this deserve my time? That single question transforms the way you move through the world. Think about someone who spends every day reacting to other people. They wake up and immediately check their phone, scrolling through messages, social media, and notifications before they have even focused on their own goals. A single negative comment ruins their mood. An unanswered text distracts them for hours. A disagreement consumes their thoughts long after it has ended. By the end of the day, they have invested more energy in other people's lives than in their own future. They believe they are simply staying connected, but psychologically, they have become dependent on external stimulation. Their attention belongs to whoever demands it the loudest. Now imagine someone living differently. They wake up with a clear objective. Their morning begins with discipline rather than distraction. They invest time in learning, building, creating, improving, and moving closer to the life they truly want. This does not mean they ignore people out of pride. They simply recognize that every unnecessary interruption carries a hidden cost. Every hour spent chasing validation is an hour that could have been invested in becoming more capable, more disciplined, and more valuable. Because their purpose demands their attention, they naturally stop reacting to things that once seemed impossible to ignore. This creates a fascinating psychological effect. People begin noticing your absence from meaningless conflict. They wonder why you no longer argue about every opinion or compete for every opportunity to be seen. The answer is simple. Your attention has become occupied by something far more important. Human beings instinctively respect those who appear driven by a mission larger than themselves. Purpose communicates confidence because it shows that your identity is not built on temporary approval. You are no longer living to impress others. You are living to fulfill something meaningful. One of the greatest mistakes people make is believing they must always remain available to maintain relationships. In reality, constant availability often reduces appreciation. When people know they can reach you at any moment regardless of how they treat you, they gradually stop valuing your time. But when your life has structure, priorities, and meaningful commitments, your availability naturally becomes limited. That limitation is not created to manipulate anyone. It is simply the result of respecting your own responsibilities. Ironically, people often appreciate your presence more when they realize your time is earned rather than guaranteed. Purpose also protects you from emotional manipulation. A person with no clear direction is easily distracted because they have nothing more important competing for their attention. But someone pursuing meaningful goals evaluates every situation differently. Before reacting, they ask whether this conflict contributes to their future or steals from it. Most distractions fail that test. They recognize that not every invitation deserves acceptance, not every criticism deserves consideration, and not every relationship deserves unlimited access to their energy. This quiet discipline gradually becomes one of the strongest forms of personal power. History consistently rewards people who remain focused while others become consumed by distraction. Great achievements are rarely built by individuals who constantly seek approval from everyone around them. They are built by people willing to sacrifice temporary attention for long-term purpose. Their success is not accidental. It is the result of thousands of small decisions to ignore what is unimportant so they could fully commit to what truly matters. The dark psychology of ignoring people reaches its highest level when ignoring is no longer something you consciously practice. It becomes a byproduct of a life filled with discipline, vision, and purpose. People stop interpreting your silence as rejection and begin recognizing it as focus. They realize you are not difficult to reach because you are playing games. You are difficult to distract because your attention has already been invested in building a life that no longer depends on constant validation from others. And once your purpose becomes stronger than every distraction, the next step is allowing your absence to reveal your true worth, because people often recognize your value only after they experience what life feels like without your presence. The moment you become deeply committed to your own purpose, something remarkable begins to happen. You stop measuring your value by who stays, who leaves, or who suddenly loses interest in you. Instead, your attention becomes invested in building a life that continues moving forward regardless of who is walking beside you. This is where the dark psychology of ignoring people reaches one of its most powerful lessons. People rarely understand the value of your presence while they have unlimited access to it. Appreciation often begins only after that access disappears. Human nature has always placed greater value on what can be lost than on what is constantly available. Robert Greene repeatedly points out that scarcity changes perception. The human mind is designed to notice absence more intensely than constant presence. When something is always available, it quietly becomes part of the background. People stop appreciating it because they begin expecting it. This is true of opportunities, relationships, respect, and even attention. Many people spend years giving their time, loyalty, and emotional support without asking whether those gifts are being valued. Then they wonder why others take them for granted. The answer is simple. Unlimited availability slowly convinces people that losing you carries no real cost. Think about someone who is always the first to call, the first to apologize, the first to fix every disagreement, and the first to sacrifice their own needs just to keep a relationship alive. At first, their effort may be appreciated, but over time it becomes expected. Their kindness transforms into routine. Their loyalty becomes assumed. Eventually, people stop seeing these actions as generous because they begin believing they are guaranteed. This is one of the quietest psychological traps in human relationships. The more desperately you try to prove your value, the more invisible that value can become. Now imagine a different person. They care deeply about the people in their life, but they also respect themselves enough to recognize when their presence is no longer appreciated. They do not threaten to leave. They do not create dramatic scenes. They simply stop forcing themselves into places where they are no longer valued. Their absence is calm, not emotional. They quietly redirect their energy toward people, goals, and environments where mutual respect still exists. This decision is not made to punish anyone. It is made to protect their own dignity. This creates a fascinating psychological effect. The moment your presence is no longer automatic, people begin noticing the space you once filled. The advice they relied on is suddenly missing. The consistency they expected is no longer there. The support they assumed would always exist has quietly disappeared. Human beings often recognize value more clearly through absence than through constant exposure. It is not because they suddenly changed overnight. It is because loss forces the mind to compare what exists now with what once existed before. That comparison creates appreciation that unlimited access rarely produces, but there is an important truth that many people misunderstand. Your absence only has meaning if your presence genuinely added value. If your contribution was built entirely on seeking approval, your absence may change very little. However, if you consistently brought honesty, reliability, emotional stability, wisdom, and genuine care into people's lives, your absence naturally creates a void. That void cannot be replaced by manipulation or emotional games. It exists because your value was real, not performed. This is why ignoring people should never become a tactic designed to make someone chase you. The moment your silence becomes a strategy for controlling another person's emotions, you have once again made your happiness dependent on their reaction. That is not strength. It is another form of emotional dependence. Real power comes from accepting that some people may never recognize your worth and choosing to move forward anyway. Your absence is not a message directed at them. It is a decision made for yourself. History repeatedly reminds us that many of the most respected individuals were fully appreciated only after they stopped giving their energy to those who refused to value it. They did not spend their lives convincing everyone of their importance. They invested their lives in becoming irreplaceable through character, discipline, and purpose. Eventually, people recognized what had been lost, not because they were manipulated into feeling guilty, but because genuine value leaves a lasting impression long after it is gone. There is another psychological principle hidden within absence. It gives people the opportunity to experience the consequences of their own choices. Constantly rescuing people from the results of their behavior often prevents growth. Sometimes the greatest lesson you can offer is simply stepping back, not with bitterness, not with revenge, but with quiet self-respect. When your presence is no longer guaranteed, people are forced to confront the reality they once ignored. Some will grow from that experience, others will not. Either way, your responsibility is not to control their realization. It is to protect your own peace. The dark psychology of ignoring people teaches that true value is never created by demanding attention. It is revealed when your absence exposes everything your presence quietly contributed. The people who genuinely valued you will recognize the difference. Those who never did were never meant to determine your worth in the first place. And once your absence begins revealing your true value, the final step is building a reputation so powerful that people respect you even when you are nowhere to be seen. Everything we have explored leads to one final truth, and it is perhaps the most important lesson of all. Protecting your attention, mastering your emotions, embracing silence, living with purpose, and allowing your absence to reveal your value are all powerful principles. But their influence remains temporary unless they become part of your character. Human beings do not build lasting opinions from isolated moments. They build them from patterns. What you consistently do becomes your reputation, and your reputation begins influencing people long before you ever enter the room. The dark psychology of ignoring people reaches its highest level when people respect your standards without needing to experience them firsthand. Because your reputation has already spoken on your behalf, Robert Greene often reminds us that reputation is an invisible force. It cannot be touched, yet it quietly shapes every interaction. Before people meet you, they hear stories. They observe your habits. They notice how you respond under pressure. They remember whether you kept your word, whether you remained calm in conflict, and whether your actions matched your principles. Long before you say your first sentence, they have already formed expectations. This is why reputation is one of the greatest forms of psychological influence. It allows your character to arrive before your presence does. Most people spend too much time trying to control individual opinions instead of building a consistent identity. They worry about every misunderstanding, every rumor, and every person who dislikes them. They explain themselves repeatedly, hoping everyone will eventually understand who they are. But human psychology rarely works that way. People trust repeated behavior far more than repeated explanations. You cannot argue your way into respect. You earn it by becoming so consistent that your actions eventually silence every unnecessary debate. Think about someone whose emotions change with every situation. One day they enforce boundaries, and the next day they abandon them because they fear losing someone's approval. They speak confidently until criticism appears, then immediately begin defending themselves. They say their time is valuable, yet they constantly rearrange their priorities for people who never appreciate the sacrifice. These contradictions create uncertainty. Others no longer know what to expect because the person's behavior depends on the moment rather than on their principles. And when people become uncertain about your character, respect slowly begins to disappear. Now imagine someone whose behavior remains steady regardless of the circumstances. Success does not make them arrogant, and failure does not make them desperate. Praise does not inflate their ego, and criticism does not destroy their confidence. They treat others with respect without abandoning respect for themselves. They remain calm when provoked because they understand that emotional discipline is stronger than emotional reaction. They protect their time, honor their commitments, and refuse to compromise their values for temporary acceptance. Over time, this consistency becomes impossible to ignore. People stop questioning where they stand because your principles have already answered that question. This is the highest level of influence. You no longer need to announce your boundaries because people already know them. You no longer need to remind others that your time matters because your actions have taught them that lesson. You no longer need to convince anyone of your worth because your life has become the evidence. Reputation is built quietly through hundreds of ordinary choices that most people overlook. Every promise you keep, every unnecessary argument you avoid, every emotional reaction you choose not to have, and every distraction you refuse to follow becomes another brick in the foundation of your character. There is another psychological truth hidden within reputation. People naturally adjust their behavior around those they deeply respect. They think more carefully before wasting your time. They choose their words more wisely because they know you will not tolerate disrespect. They stop testing your limits because history has already shown them that your standards are real. This does not happen because you demanded better treatment. It happens because your consistency removed every doubt about who you are. Human beings eventually stop challenging people whose principles remain stronger than external pressure. Many people believe the goal of ignoring others is to make them miss you, but that is only a temporary victory. The greater achievement is becoming someone whose absence never weakens their influence. Even when you are not in the room, your discipline, integrity, and self-respect continue shaping how people think about you. They remember the way you carried yourself. They remember that you never chased attention, never compromised your values for approval, and never allowed emotions to control your decisions. That memory becomes more powerful than any single conversation because it reflects your character rather than your performance. In the end, The dark psychology of ignoring people is not about punishing others with silence or making them regret losing you. It is about becoming so emotionally independent, so purpose-driven, and so unwavering in your principles that your attention is no longer controlled by the opinions, actions, or validation of other people. When your life is built on genuine self-respect instead of constant approval, ignoring unnecessary distractions becomes effortless. And when that way of living is repeated every day, it transforms into a reputation that commands quiet respect wherever you go. The greatest power is not making people notice your silence. It is becoming the kind of person whose character leaves a lasting impression, whether you are present or not.